Hey guys, so tonight we're going to be doing a follow-on video to a previous one we did talking about Jesus' use of sleeping terminology in John chapter 11 and Matthew chapter 9. And now we're just going to be looking at a couple things in a bit more detail. So here are the topics that we're going to be going over here. The follow-on question that we're going to be talking about is, does Jesus' use of the sleeping terminology have anything to do with resuscitation? So basically, is he using the word sleep rather than death simply because we know that these people will be resuscitated? And we're going to talk about the two cases that we've already been focusing on. So Lazarus' case in John chapter 11 and Jairus' daughter's case in Matthew chapter 9. And we're going to argue that sleeping is actually primarily associated with death, not resuscitation. So the answer to this particular question is no, not really. Jesus is using sleep as a euphemism for death and then taking advantage of the associations there, rather than really it having very much to do with resuscitation directly. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about that linguistic connection between death and sleep. And so this isn't just Greek and Hebrew, this is sort of most languages, in fact, kind of have a tie between these two concepts. And that kind of explains why Jesus uses sleep for death in these cases as well. So it's kind of nothing out of the ordinary, we would say. Okay, so first thing, just going over that question again in a little bit more detail here. We're just going to pose it as this. Could the reason that Jesus used sleeping terminology in John chapter 11 and Matthew chapter 9, so that is with Lazarus and Jairus' daughter, have anything to do with the fact that these individuals would be resuscitated and wake up again, as opposed to people who die but are not resuscitated? And so the idea here behind this question is sort of, if Jesus knew that these people would wake up, and we know that people from sleep wake up, then maybe that's why he would use the word sleep here instead of death. Like, it could be sort of foreshadowing, if you will, the idea that these people would be raised from the dead, resuscitated, come back to life in a way that most people who die are not. And so could Jesus have been using this sort of to say that, no, these people aren't dead, they are going to come back to life, as sort of like a word choice to reflect that foreknowledge? And so could that be why Jesus used this terminology of sleeping rather than just coming right out and saying directly that they were dead? And so the short answer to this question is, I really don't think this is the case. I think Jesus' use of the sleeping terminology in John chapter 11 and Matthew chapter 9 is actually completely separate from his foreknowledge that these folks would be resuscitated rather than staying dead. So Jesus obviously knew that he was going to raise them from the dead, but I don't think that he was using this terminology of sleep rather than death just because he knew that they would be resuscitated. I think he's using it, as we shall see, just because that is such a common association between these words, between sleep and death. So in Greek and Hebrew and English and most other languages too, presumably, that he's using this because sleep is so tightly coupled with death, and it really doesn't have very much to do with resuscitation on the whole of it. So in the case of Lazarus in John chapter 11, the euphemism, that is using sleep as a euphemism for death, well, it would actually be just as true in their culture if Lazarus was never resuscitated and stayed dead. That is, as we went over in the previous video, we know that perhaps in the Hebrew culture at the time in which Jesus was around, they had this association between sleep and death kind of in a way that we don't so much in English. It's not that that is never used as an association, but it's just probably not as common in our everyday speech as it was for them as a euphemism. So, we say things like someone passed away and things like that. But for them, this was a pretty common euphemism for death. And so the point I'm making here is that most of the time when people use this euphemism, the person who they were using it of, they didn't come back to life. So, in fact, this is kind of an atypical case, because mostly when people said that, they meant that someone is dead, like as in very dead and not coming back. And so it would kind of almost undercut the exact question we're asking here of, would Jesus use this specifically to foreshadow or kind of make it clear that these people were going to be awakened from their quote unquote sleep? The answer is kind of no, because the very fact that he uses this, the very fact that it's a thing in their culture, that association, like 99.9% of the time, doesn't refer to people who are resuscitated, because, across the entire biblical narrative, there aren't very many people who are ever raised from the dead. So Jesus, it wasn't just Lazarus and Jairus' daughter. There was the widow's son, a widow of Nain in forget where exactly that is. I think it's in Luke chapter 7, I want to say. We went over that in the previous video, but there really aren't very many instances of this. So for the most part, culturally, they would use this expecting the person who they say is quote unquote sleeping to stay dead. That is the euphemism that they would be using, most commonly applied in the case of people who wouldn't be resurrected. And so you can kind of see how that means that this question, I mean, it's a reasonable question, because people do wake up from sleep and people don't come back from death. And so you can kind of see, well, maybe the word choice would be special because of that, but actually just because of how this euphemism would be used culturally, that kind of isn't the right way to think about it. And so all this to say, this particular case with Lazarus, it would be more normal for people to expect Lazarus not to come back. And so when Jesus says this, everyone would know that he was using it as a euphemism, because as we discussed previously, by the time Jesus got to Bethany, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived, Lazarus had already been entombed for 4 days. And so everyone clearly knows that Lazarus is dead. And so that's why when Jesus says this, they would know that he's using this as a euphemism for death, and it wouldn't have any significance. Like they wouldn't look at him and be like, well, he said he's sleeping, so that must mean that it's something different. Like, oh, what's Jesus going to do now? They would understand this as a clear reference to Lazarus actually being dead. Now, when it comes to the case of Jairus' daughter, it's basically the same thing that we talked about before. So I argued in the previous video that even though Jesus knew that she was actually dead, he said what he did. That is, he took advantage of this association between sleeping and death that was this common euphemism, especially in their culture, to kind of make things purposely ambiguous to others, so that neither he nor the girl and her family would receive as much negative attention from it. And we went into the reasons for that in the last video, but the point is here that Jesus used the sleep terminology not because he was making the point that she was going to be awakened as opposed to most other people, but he was using it in association with the euphemism that we've gone over, specifically to make it unclear in this particular case whether she actually was dead or not. Playing off this idea that there is this association between these concepts. Well, people who weren't in the room with them when Jesus raised her from the dead would hear this, well, people thought she was dead. Her family had called the professional mourners. They were mocking him, saying, no, she's actually dead, silly. Why are you going in there? And then Jesus does this and says, no, she's just asleep, purposefully to kind of muddy the waters so that it would kind of run this interference between his ministry and these people who would be wowed by the celebrity of it. And the same thing with the girl and her family, like we argued in that other video, to kind of keep all of the attention and the pressure and even the potential for the rulers of the Jewish people at the time to target them, specifically because, as we learn in John chapter 12, they were seeking to kill Lazarus because his testimony, basically, of, well, I was dead and Jesus raised me, was causing people to believe. And so, obviously, these folks had a personal stake in making people not believe. Jesus's the gospel it wasn't subversive politically, but it turned people away from the ruling powers that be. Basically, they couldn't control people if people were believing the truth. And so they would seek to actually put Lazarus to death, like we talked about in the last video. And so to spare this family that, Jesus would use this association to make things less than clear, right? So people might say, well, people don't rise from the dead. There's no way he did that. So she must have actually only been sleeping, and they just made a mistake. She wasn't actually dead, she just looked dead. People would kind of start that rumor because of this. And so, as we've said, that's kind of my take on why Jesus did this, why he used that terminology in this case in Matthew chapter 9. But the point is, it's still not specifically because Jesus foreknew that she would be raised. As in, he would have said this, regardless. It wasn't to foreshadow the fact that she'd be resuscitated so much as it was to play into this whole purpose that we talked about previously. All right, so to finish off this video, we're just going to talk a little bit more about the associations between sleeping and death and how that's kind of the relationship here, not so much between sleeping and resuscitation. So kind of what we just talked about in these two cases was how neither in John chapter 11 or Matthew chapter 9 was Jesus's use of the terminology kind of directly tied to the resuscitation, even though it ended up turning up in both of these cases where resuscitation was present. And so that kind of what that means is that I see the association of sleeping as being primarily with death, not with resuscitation. So kind of the sleeping terminology showed up here because these people were dead in the case of Lazarus, or because Jesus was trying to make it purposefully ambiguous for practical reasons in the case of Jairus' daughter, not because these people were going to be resuscitated. And so further evidence that this is kind of the case, that is that the association goes that direction, is that there's actually places where sleeping is mentioned alongside death, but not resuscitation. So in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 10, this reads, "Then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David." And so that is a way of saying, well, David died and then was, buried in the city of David. So this is a clear reference to sleep being used for death as a euphemism, but there is no resurrection after this. David was not one of the people in the Bible that was raised from the dead. So this is an example of sleeping being mentioned alongside death in a case that has absolutely nothing to do with resuscitation. And there's also kind of the reverse case here. There's also places where resuscitation is mentioned, but no mention of sleeping at all. And so an example of this comes in Acts chapter 20, when Paul raises a young man named Eutychus from the dead after he falls out of a window when Paul was teaching late at night. So this particular story, I'm not really going to pull it up, but you can check the references here. Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12, gives this account of Paul raising this young man from the dead, and nowhere in that account is sleeping mentioned. And so kind of the thesis of the question here was, well, could the sleeping-related language be related to this idea of resuscitation? Well, if that were the case, maybe we'd expect it to show up here as well. So it kind of runs counter to that idea. And so these observations are just kind of pointing out how the evidence here really does show that the sleep references are primarily associated with death, not resuscitation. And so that's kind of how we should think about this topic. That's where the evidence of Scripture points. Finally, we're just going to go into a little bit more detail about this association here that we just introduced between sleeping and death. So first off, kind of speaking in terms of linguistic associations, the verb for raising someone from death, so someone who has died, raising them from the dead, is actually the same verb as awakening or rousing someone from sleep in both Hebrew and Greek. So this verb here, kutz in Hebrew and egeira in Greek, these are the verbs in question here. And the relevant concordance entries for this particular type of usage, that is when the verbs are being used to raise people from the dead rather than waking them up from sleep, you'll see that it's the same verb for both of these cases, actually. And so kind of why this is relevant is then you can see how closely the concepts of sleep and death are related to each other in both Hebrew and Greek then. And so that is sort of indirect evidence. We can actually see sort of some direct references to this that kind of push the metaphor or push the euphemism even further here. So we're going to look at some passages here from Jeremiah and Job, and just kind of show how this association between sleeping and death it's mentioned right there in the Bible, very unambiguously. So here's one of those verses from Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 39 says this: "When they become heated up, I will serve them their banquet and make them drunk, that they may become jubilant and may sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake up, declares the Lord." So this perpetual sleep that they don't wake up from, that is what death would be. And then another verse, same chapter, a few verses later, Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 57 says, "I will make her princes and her wise men drunk, her governors, her prefects, and her mighty men, that they may sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake up, declares the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts." And so again, we see this reference to a perpetual sleep that people won't wake up from. And this is how we clearly see that sleep is being used to refer to death, and that there's this strong association between the concepts. Finally, this passage here from Job chapter 14, Job chapter 14, verse 12 says, "So man lies down and does not rise until the heavens are no longer. He will not awake nor be aroused out of his sleep." So again, this idea that people who are dead are sleeping until the resurrection actually, shows up elsewhere. But this concept, again, just showing that this idea of sleeping is used of people who are dead. And then sort of similar concept here, we have some passages that talk about how people who are buried, as was the funerary custom of the ancient Hebrew people, as in they buried their dead rather than cremating them, for example. Well, it describes people who are buried as actually sleeping in the ground. So Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." So actually, sort of a side note here, this is a reference to the resurrection here in the book of Daniel. So not even New Testament, Old Testament here. But you can see clearly that this verse is referencing those who sleep in the dust of the ground, i.e. people who are dead. And so again, just strengthening that association between the two concepts. And so sort of where we're going with all this is that it's not just by accident that these verbs overlap in usage, but because of an enduring semantic relationship between the concepts of sleeping and death that's actually present in English as well. And so to talk about this, we're going to be looking at a sonnet here from a guy named John Donne. So this one's a pretty famous poem. You may have heard of it before. It's called "Death Be Not Proud." So I'm just going to go ahead and read through this briefly here, and then we'll talk about several of the lines that are kind of related to this conceptual association that we're talking about. So, "Death Be Not Proud" by John Donne. "Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, for death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which by thy pictures be much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die." Okay, so obviously poetic language here, but some of these lines that we are going to talk about, this line here, "From rest and sleep, which by thy pictures be." So not so much a metaphor there, but clearly linking the concepts of rest and sleep with death. And then, rest of their bones in this line, that is definitely poetic language here, but, laying someone to rest. We have that turn of phrase just in kind of normal English parlance. Laying someone to rest, i.e. burying them, well, that is an association there. But perhaps most clearly, we have this poppy or charms can make us sleep as well. Well, this is actually directly associating sleep with death, right? If we're saying that as well here, that is poppies and charms can make us sleep just like how death can make us sleep. That's the association here. And then, of course, final line, "One short sleep past, we wake eternally." To the resurrection, like like Daniel chapter 12 talked about, actually. Um, but you can kind of clearly see that this is an English poem, and clearly has this association between sleep and death here in English. So not that we're going to build our theology off of John Donne's sonnet, but you can kind of get the idea that the association is there even in English as well. Now, just to close, I would actually probably think that this association between sleep and death is present in most human languages. I haven't done a formal study of it, but it kind of just makes sense for us humans to associate these two concepts because they do have similar surface appearances. So if someone is kind of looking at someone lying on a bed from a distance, it can be kind of hard to tell if the person is living or dead, or if they're just asleep. So, I mean, obviously, people's chest rising and falling from breathing, that's one sign. Do they have breath? Because as we talked about in our last video, breath is actually synonymous with life. So people are alive when they have breath. That signifies the presence of the human spirit. And when people die physically, they no longer have breath. And that's because the word for spirit and breath are synonyms in both Greek and Hebrew. It's the same word. You use the same word in Greek and Hebrew to denote breath and spirit, the presence of the spirit. So that's where we're going to close this one. Again, not such a revolutionary point here. We've just gone through and shown that there is a clear association between sleep and death in both Greek and Hebrew. Gave some examples, how the verbs are actually, the verb to wake people up is actually the same as the verb to raise them from the dead. And some of these textual examples that just show that the concepts are clearly associated in how they think about them, as well as in English and presumably in most other languages. But this is all why we say that the associations are between sleep and death much more than they are between sleep and resuscitation, which was kind of the main thrust of the initial question here. All right, so just to briefly recap what we've gone over in this video, we kind of raised the question up front of, could Jesus have been using this language of sleep because he foreknew that these people would be resuscitated and sleep is less permanent than death? So that was kind of the question we started with here. We talked about Lazarus's case, how he'd already been dead for 4 days between Jesus got there. So when he used that word, people would have obviously taken it. They would have known that he was referring to death. And Jairus' daughter's case, which, as we talked about previously in the other video, Jesus did this primarily to kind of leave strategic ambiguity in that situation, to kind of run interference both for himself and his own ministry, as well as this girl and her family. So those are Jesus's purposes in using the terminology, like we argued in the last video. But kind of more to answer the point of the question, we said that sleeping is primarily associated with death and not resuscitation. So we talked about how the verbs in Greek and Hebrew for waking someone up are actually used to signify raising someone from the dead. The same verb is used for both things. And then we actually talked about how that association is present in English as well. So this is kind of closing off that question to say that actually it's much more likely, in fact, it is the case, that the sleep references here that Jesus uses have much more to do with death. That is the relationship, that's why he's using these words, than they did with the fact that these particular people would be resurrected.